Welcome, everybody, to this Canadian Patriot broadcast. I am very, very happy to be joined by Peter Scholz, somebody who I was having. I was invited to speak at a Sean Newman Cornerstone event a couple of months ago in Alberta, and I had a little book table, and Peter shows up, and we start chatting, and he talks about a project that he had been working on that I have been inspired by. It for people who've been reading the Canadian Patriot material, they've noticed that I've been putting a lot of emphasis upon Arctic development, the importance of looking with a vision towards a multi-generational strategy towards the Arctic. And a recent project that caught my radar some years back was the Alaska to Canada, Alaska to Alberta sort of railway that would connect the lower 48 states with Alaska for the first time. That would be a really big rejuvenating idea that was even given support by President Trump in his first term in office. Very
Mhm.
exciting, blew my mind. And Peter comes up to me and he's like, "Yeah, I was involved with that." And then he's tells me about why that didn't work and how something completely new has been brought online around something called Aurora Railway, which he showed me a graph, an image, a map. I'm going to show that to the audience here in a second. And I was just dumbfounded that I didn't know about any of that. So, Peter, thank you for agreeing to come on and elaborate a little bit more on your what brought you here and what this vision is for Canada. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks. My pleasure to be here. Um, and I'm not sure where you'd like me to begin. When I was recruited by A2A Rail, when I was fired by A2A Rail, or where
Well, maybe
things
for
are
the
now,
first,
or
yeah, I mean, I guess the thing might be, well, maybe you could elaborate quickly. What was the idea for A2A Rail? How did you get involved quickly? And then we'll just shift gears to why that didn't really pan out, and then transition to what the current strategic game plan is that you've put into motion and that we're trying to bring attention to right now that could really give Canada a vital boost for the coming generations.
sure, I'd be happy to. Where I use names, the names and the situations are available publicly. I'm protecting myself, and where there's certain names that are not released publicly, I'm not going to say it because I don't want to end up getting a lawsuit. But so where you say this person did this, yes, you can find on a legal record they person, so I don't have to worry about that front. Um, So A2A started sort of around 2015. The Lieutenant Governor of Alaska, or former Lieutenant Governor of Alaska, um, created the corporation and was involved in hiring Sean McCoshen, who was a Manitoba-based businessman, to be the president of the company. This is all before my time. They started doing it the normal way. They were receiving funding from something called Bridging Finance, based out of Toronto, and they were doing engineering studies, and they were doing the usual approach. You develop the project, you define it, you go to the First Nations, and you do your consultation. And they were hitting roadblock after roadblock, and they decided to shift gears and put First Nations in charge at 49% ownership. At that stage, they created a subgroup called the Northern Engagement Team, which was led by an individual by the name of J.B. Gladue, who is a wonderful person. I've worked with him, and I like to consider him a friend and a mentor. And he hired other wonderful people, like Ken Coates, a prominent Canadian historian and Aboriginal rights active promoter, to do it from the ground up, talk to the nations, and get the railway on the right track, per se. So that's what we did, and we were operating within the A2A milieu. And that one, I was recruited when I was living in Nunavut at the time. I was recruited out, relocated with my my wife and my three children, which became four while I was working at A2A Rail. But we started smelling rotten fish coming out of the vents. The way money was being spent was there was a lot of irresponsible work being done. The engineers were creating work for themselves. I'm not going to mention their name, so to protect myself, but there was unnecessary work being done. I won't go into detail, but they're padding. And Sean McCoshen just seemed to be living too well a life for a business startup, if you know what I
Mm,
mean.
okay.
And then in May,
Oh, yeah.
oh
Just
well,
a quick, yeah, just
but
to let the audience just see quickly for those who may not know, this is the one of the many very, very wonderful graphs that were showcased for the Alaska to Canada Alberta Railway sort of consortium, featuring one of the core arteries that would open up tons of development that is currently inaccessible in the Arctic, in the north of Canada, that would, for the first time, tie by rail Canada to Alaska. So again, very cool
Yeah.
idea, but unfortunately, a lot of mismanagement along the way.
Yes,
Right.
exactly. So the railway, we had a very prominent management consulting firm, which I'm not going to name the name of, but you can probably guess what it is. Worked for Trudeau a lot. It they it was basically pipeline and rail. They're going to move raw bitumen from the oil sands in Alberta to Tidewater, Alaska. They started off with Anchorage and South Central ports because there's four ports in South Central that are all close to Anchorage. And Anchorage is a year-round like ice-free port. And they got a few major milestones on that. Number one, they got Trump issued a cross-border permit for the railway to cross from Yukon to Alaska at a remote location, sort of west of Dawson City. And they got an exclusive agreement, which is still standing with the Alaska Railroad to use their railway. So they only had to go and they also got an agreement with the Department of Defense to build a railway extension from the Alaska Railroad from Fairbanks down to a remote location called Delta Junction, which is sort of halfway to Tok. And Tok is kind of like the small logistics hub in eastern central Alaska. So we just had to get to Delta Junction. We'd meet the Alaska Railway, and Bob's your uncle. We'd have to upgrade eventually have to upgrade the Alaska Railway, it'd be a couple billion bucks. This was all working off a Van Horn Institute report, which had initially been commissioned by another company called G7G, but they weren't doing the hard work. A2A took it over, took that work and was doing the hard work, like the engineering. And we had the engineering plans for Alaska are basically finished. They're right down to, take, gravel take. You need so much. The bridge needs to be 252 meters here. It's that level of engineering.
Wow.
So what happened in May of 2021? What happened in April is I was pushing, and I'm like, okay, you have this railway that's stopping at Fort McKay, and you've got a heavy haul railway coming up to Fort McMurray on the CN line. What happens if you connect them and suddenly you can get a heavy haul train from Chicago or Memphis or Miami or Dallas to Anchorage? How does that affect things? And I've been started saying that I'm a planner type, and I was getting it brushed aside for a couple months, and then I was like, okay, let's look what happens. And the consulting company in question ran the numbers, and they looked at all the different commodities and mines and backlogs and transit delays of the U.S. West Coast ports, and came up with something like 30 to 40 million tons on the first year of operation, moving up to like 80 to 100 million tons a year by 2075 or something.
Mhm.
But this is basically lower 48 to Alaska trade. Those numbers are enough to handle a railway without the bitumen. So the bitumen becomes an add-on.
Wow.
So I was like, well, why aren't we building this thing? So you've got two economic drivers. That happened in April. And then in May, my fourth child was born. And then 2 weeks later, um, basically it got wind that Bridging Finance was overpaying Sean McCoshen, was overpaying A2A Rail. Sean McCoshen was paying himself way more than a startup owner should be paying. He took his cookie out of the cookie jar. He split it and gave some back to the owners of Bridging Finance. I'm comfortable saying that because these guys are now like they're in court, and they've been declared guilty and all that kind of stuff. So
Okay.
I'm not defaming them. But that shit, Ontario Securities Commission came in and said, we're shutting down the whole thing right now. And went to audit. So I'm holding my 2-week-old daughter in my arms. It was the meeting where I'm introducing the daughter to my team on, it's COVID time, so it's all online. And it's like, pens down, you're laid off. And JP Gladue stayed on, like it's now a major reputational risk for him. He stayed on, and he made sure that people got their last paycheck, right? So that was, I owe an eternal debt of gratitude to him. And that's where we are. So what you looked at, the Aurora Rail thing, was basically a mental health exercise for me, because number one, building a railway, it becomes your whole person. It's like that is the career side of your world, is building this thing and all the details around it. And it becomes a passion project, and it's a multi-person passion project.
Yeah.
And number two, like I was working with really awesome people. at the Northern Engagement team. The people I've already mentioned and a few others. They were mentors, they were guides, they were, well-intentioned. We were going to build a better country. And, it became a worst case scenario. It went to MNP and they're like, we only have so much money. We're going to pay off the primary creditors, you as a contractor or a third grade creditor. So we're going to give you, $900 out of your severance or whatever. And then, you find out that they're refusing to entertain sales processes. So I wrote the map, just getting all the routing information that was in my brain at the time onto a piece of paper. I called it Aurora Rail, whatever. Um, Let it sit and I did that map and then let it sit for 2 years. In
Gonna, I'm gonna
2023,
I'm gonna
go
quickly
ahead.
just show the map here, just so people it's not so ephemeral. Here, that's the map you sent me as a PDF, and it's pretty much the same thing as the pamphlet that you printed out for me that you handed to me a couple of months ago, featuring designs for a multi-phased growth of rail and resources in Canada. So that's just we're going to talk about that in more detail, but I want people just to have that in their mind as one image. So it's not just
Sure.
about Alaska to Alberta with a bit of Yukon. It's not about that anymore. It's much more comprehensive. So
Yeah,
yeah,
appreciate that. What you're looking at is represents about 1,000 hours of my time over the last 3 years, unpaid, of the A2A information is on here, but also I've gone through the University of Alberta Railway Atlas, the work of the original settlers and the Grand Trunk Railway folks, all the different rail routes that were proposed or proven out over the last 120 years. Why is rail? We're all talking about pipelines and energy, and so why am I talking about rail? Like, isn't rail so 18th century, Peter? It is and isn't, and it isn't. Number one, rail is the most topographically limited mode. The trains do not like to go left or right, and they really don't like going up or down. They are heavy, they move at 80 kilometers, they don't like turning, but they can carry anything. And they can carry huge quantities of everything. They are transformative. When you put a coast-to-coast railway through a town, that town becomes a city. When you put a pipeline through a place, um, the folks at one end make money, the folks at the other end make money, the folks in the middle make a little bit of money because they're just basically watching the pipeline for leaks. And then 30 years when the gas runs out, they decommission the pipeline and things are back where they were. Having said that, pipelines transfer liquid fuels 5 times cheaper than trains. But my point is, if you identify the corridors based on the rail, then you can put any other mode in it. All of the routes you see are friendly to rail. Green is confirmed out by engineers. Yellow is highly probable. Red is has existed or does exist. A lot of railways have been shut down over the last 20 years with privatization of CN and CPKC. As they reduce services, people stop using the trains, they switch to trucks, and then they go, oh, well, we're not making much money, so they shut down all these shuntings. There's now Saskatchewan is suffering from a major rail desert through most of the province and also eastern Alberta. Um, so this is the latest version. The name Aurora Rail, you can take it or leave it. I've sort of changed it to Athabasca Rail. It's going to be Indigenous owned at the end of the day, the corridor system. So it may be some completely different name. Athabasca is the name of the language group of this part of North America, all the way up to Alaska. So I think it's appropriate, but First Nation, the Indigenous persons may choose a different name down the road.
mm, yeah. And I was reminded a little bit of Thomas Coltrane Kiefer, a famous Canadian rail engineer, who played a big role in the Welland Canal and just early
Mm.
19th century nation building projects. And he wrote a book called The Philosophy of Railroads, which made a point the railroad should be conceptualized as the iron civilizer because its very existence, as you just pointed out, is to transform and upshift the cultural levels in every single part of the world that the rail runs through. All of a sudden you have to build new industries, new manufacturing in each of the areas that are going to be stimulated to build this very massive I mean, it's a very long-term project. And also you can access all of a sudden tons of new resources that are inaccessible, which is a big part, I think, of your designs too. Of like there's a lot of resources in Canada. It's incredible. It's not just oil and natural gas, that too. But there's so many other things. There's rare earths. There's so many things that we could I mean you could do so much good for Canada but also the world if we could tap it, but there's no roads, there's no rail, so it's not really a resource in that sense. but you've mapped out quite a number of these different potentials as part of your designs too. So what would some of those be that are the most exciting for you?
I'd be comfortable to say I've mapped out all of them, actually.
Oh, okay.
From the CF, with my baseline being the CN rail from Prince Rupert to Winnipeg is my baseline. Everything north, I'm 98% certain I've got all of them. Now, out in the tundra where it's flat or the prairies, you can find, that's part of the reason the line is yellow. You can go here, or you can go 50 kilometers over. It's the same thing. So, I mean, keep in mind flatlands, you can kind of go wherever you want.
Mm,
I think the key things for resources that people should know about, and I don't know if you want me to take over. Like I
yeah.
could, I could do a screen share, and then I can zoom in on certain locations. And there's some stuff that I think people would be interested to know about if
Yeah, man,
they're
absolutely.
geography geek
Yeah,
like me.
you are yeah, this we're speaking of the geeks out there. So yeah, like and the wannabe geeks, people who should become geeks to be better patriots, who need to think on a higher level. So yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
Sure, no, I appreciate that. So you almost have to think of this like a bit of a triangle. There's Prince Rupert, North BC coast, and then you have very rugged coastline all the way up to Valdez and Anchorage.
Mm,
Valdez is a deep water port, but there's not a lot of space for port facilities, so it's really just good for loading fuel stuffs. And the Anchorage and South Central can handle pretty much anything. And then, people are talking about Hudson Bay. So in terms of resources, I actually think the most important resource in all of this is gravel. And you go,
Gravel.
gravel, gravel. Good
Okay.
gravel is very hard to come by. There are trucks going, for example, from south central Alberta up to Fort McMurray because there's no good gravel.
Oh,
People are driving 6 hours to carry a load of gravel. Once you get into the mountains, there's a lot of rock, but out in northern Alberta and most of the territories, there's almost no gravel. Construction costs are very, very high. There's isolated uskers and stuff. And especially when you're dealing with permafrost, you need very thick ballast layers for highways and trains. So I actually think the first thing that's going to be shipped on this and the starting points of construction is going to be gravel.
mm,
The second most important one is bitumen. Obviously, we all heard about the oil sands. The oil sands are actually divided into three pieces, and it's best to think of this as a triangle. I'm zooming in here on the Fort McMurray area. Understand the rivers. Here's the Athabasca River. Can you guys see my cursor?
oh yeah.
Okay, so the Athabasca River is coming down here. It goes to Fort McMurray, it makes a left turn, and it heads north. And then you've got the Clearwater coming in, and that makes a natural triangle. These are 150-meter deep canyons, and Fort McMurray is where's the center of the point. And that's part of the reason Fort McMurray is there. The existing rail line, the Murray line, which is owned by CN Rail, stops at McMurray Airport before it descends down into the valley. You can get down into the valley to extend up to the oil sands by rail, but you'll have to put a railway, you'll have to knock out a few houses, you'll have to put a railway right through the middle of downtown Fort McMurray, you'll have to cut off a golf course from the river. You get the idea. It'd be messy, very
Yeah.
messy, and very expensive. So you have one major area of bitumen is south of Fort McMurray at near Anzac, Alberta. There's two Anzacs, one in BC, one in Alberta. Don't get them mixed up. Anzac, Alberta has one area stock of bitumen, and this railway primarily serves this stock. There's another stock at Firebag, which is on the northeast corner. That is the big one. That's Firebag. It's a whole cornucopia of massive amounts of resources, which does extend into Saskatchewan as far as the Simonson deposit. And then you have a smaller deposits over on the west side of the Athabasca at the Thickwood Hills. A2A, this is their terminus right there, right next to Tar Island, where there's usually the first phase of bitumen separation. What that means is the bitumen goes there. It's a mixture of solids and liquids. They separate the liquids from the solids. They dump the solids. They put it in this lake, and then they ship the liquids out by pipeline. What Alberta Innovates has done is they figured out a way to turn the solids into the world's best quality asphalt.
Wow.
So one discussion that I am in with is with the local First Nations and Alberta Innovates. And I'm saying, you can't, when we're talking about, like, okay, think of all the bitumen's extracted, half of that is asphalt. The world needs asphalt. Okay, so it's a whole other industry that's just being dumped right now. You can't get that on pipeline. You can heat up the raw bitumen and ship it through some mega pipeline down to Edmonton, separate it down there, in which case you're dumping all the salt, in which case you're developing the asphalt down there. Or you can separate it at Fort McMurray, which creates a permanent um, manufacturing. It's basically permanent. The size of the resource and the fact that the world's, we could all switch to electrified cars. We're still going to need asphalt for roads,
Yeah.
and that's the whole world. So that's one
Yeah,
thing we're looking at.
you'd build a completely new manufacturing sector right there
Yes.
and grow
Yeah.
but 10, 20 times
Okay.
Fort McMurray. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Local. I'm talking directly to right now to Brian Jean, the MLA and Minister in Energy. You want this. You want rail access to getting north of Fort McMurray so you can access these separation facilities. A2A was going to stop right there, and then it was envisioned as a bitumen by rail pipe, bitumen by rail, so it would head up north to Fort Vermilion. I'll zoom out a little bit. We're talking about resources. So where's the other major resources is people don't know about what the treasure trove is on the Yukon NWT border. A lot of people have heard of Cantong, which was the largest tungsten deposit in the West, to the best of my knowledge. What is the importance of tungsten? It's a hardener. It's a metal that is used that is alloyed with other metals to make a hardener. You cannot make a bullet or a missile without tungsten. Most of the tungsten that the Western militaries now use is from other locations like Africa or China. If, worst case scenario, there's military conflict, do you think China would shut off their exports of tungsten? Yes. So we found the next biggest deposit of tungsten in the West, which is Mactung at McMillan Pass. McMillan Pass is a little famous because it's where the Canal Road would cross over the Mackenzie Mountains, and that was built in the World War II to connect the Norman Wells by road to the Alaska Highway to get fuel to Alaska and Yukon in the event of a Japanese invasion. It's also a very beautiful location and just north of all of the new national parks that have gone in there. Anyway, they've also discovered this massive tungsten deposit there. So it was sitting there for years doing nothing. Canadians did nothing. The US military comes along and they go to the company that owns Mactung and says, okay, we'll give you millions of dollars to figure out how to get the tungsten out because it's in the middle of nowhere. The Canal Road is basically a dirt track now. Trucks can be used for heavy ore mines. Now, I'm going to sidetrack here. There's two types of mines. There's heavy ore mines, and then there's there's precious metals mines. With the precious metals or rare earths like gold or lithium or whatever, you tend to have small quantities that are extracted from very large amounts of ore. The economic preference is to do as much extraction as you can on site so you're not moving all this ore and then you just either drive it out or fly it out. When dealing with heavy ore mines like tungsten or copper or iron, you can do it by truck. Yes, but you got a truck every like 60 seconds running 12 or 24 hours a day. And that's where, you really need to just have a train. Otherwise the amount of wear and tear on the environment just gets ridiculous. And
Yeah.
so there's Mactung. The U.S. Department of Defense offered this company millions of dollars to build it, and then guess what? The Canadians anteed up and said, "Okay, we'll offer that amount plus $50 to do the same thing because it's a Canadian project." So and that's they're working on right now. And there's other major deposits in the McMillan Pass. Then you have Selwyn, which is zinc copper, which would extract 20 years approximately of copper and zinc at like 1 million tons a year. And it's now owned by a Chinese company that's not working on it. But when they were doing initial development plans, they said, let's build a railway from Selwyn down to Watson Lake for transfer. And the big one that nobody knows about is Crest. Crest is really remote, like really, really remote. It's also got the best I've heard is 16 billion tons of iron ore grading 50% plus.
Hmm.
That's 16
And
billion to be. It's one of the largest iron ore deposits on the planet, and it's sitting in the middle of nowhere. And it's 2/3 in Yukon and 1/3 in Northwest Territories. You remember the whole Peel River Save the Peel thing about 10 years
yeah,
ago?
yeah.
Okay. Crest is in the Peel. My little conspiracy brain gets a little bit suspicious that they push so hard. And I'm a planner, so I know the dirty tricks that were done to get the whole Peel into basically turning the entire Peel region into a conservation
In
zone.
order to make it specifically off limits from human touch under the veil of nature conservation and
Yes.
protection. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Um, it's a long story, but basically the the land use plan for northern Yukon used a ecological thresholds system where it divided into sub-ecozones, and then there's a certain linear and aerial impact that can be done without impacting the local fauna, which is the main one of concern is caribou.
Mm.
And it would and then say these areas are more important, those are not. So we should have limited develop or restricted development. But the way it approached it is, once you hit a certain limit of the amount of roads or tracks or aerial impact, then you can't do more without mitigating what has already been disturbed.
Yep.
Okay. So it was a very responsible approach. I know the man that designed it. He's a very competent ecologist and biologist now working. I'm not sure I want people to track it down, but anyway, he's very competent. At Peel, they used the same approach, but they changed the variable so high that over 90% of the Peel region was declared a conservation zone with zero development permitted. And the Crest deposit in that land use plan has one line saying, this deposit is large. I'm paraphrasing, but very close. This deposit is large, but it is too remote to ever conceivably be used. So it should not impact the decision of whether to do this. And this Peel plan, all over Whitehorse for 5 years, there's all these save the Peel stickers on everybody's bump. There's a very well planned, very well financed demand to save to keep that in the ground.
Mm-hmm.
There's other major deposits mentioned is Casino, which is near the Yukon River, which it's another heavy ore. I can't remember which one off the top of my head for sure. And that was on the original A2A route. So the original A2A route would start at near Fort McKay, follow up through Fort Vermilion, and go through Fort Liard in Northwest Territories, go through the toe of Yukon into Watson Lake, then up the Tintina Trench, past Casino, cross the Alaska border at this extremely remote location on the Ladue River Valley, then descend down into Tok, and then, as I said, go up a few hundred kilometers up to Delta Junction, where it would meet the Alaska Railroad, which had been extended eastwards from North Pole, Alaska. That was
Just to be
A2A.
clear, in red exists already, right?
Yes.
And everything else does not exist as rail yet, right?
Yes. Where you see black lines, it means that an engineer or a surveyor has said somewhere you can build there. You can put a
It just
railway.
boggles my mind, right? That all of that, I don't know how many, it's well over 1,000 miles or kilometers of space separate the lower existent rail in British Columbia with the Alaskan rail. It blows my mind that that has not been done yet. Even it just is dizzying. It's a dizzying idea. Sorry, I just wanted to throw that in there.
There's been a lot of ideas. The closest that came was Premier Wacky Bennett, WAC Bennett of British Columbia back in the 1970s, financed the construction of a railway up to Dease Lake.
Yeah.
And then the project was shelved before it was finished after he was premier, and there was a full investigation. It's like there's lack of a major plan. I mean, there's some vague ideas about extending up to Watson Lake and then meeting the line over from Fort Nelson would come to Watson Lake, and then Dease Lake would go up to Watson Lake, and you'd have this giant circle from Prince George all the way up to Watson Lake, all through northern BC, and that's what he was thinking. But it was like, what is going to carry?
Yeah. Sorry.
So this, and they went so far as to put a quite a significant bridge across the Stikine River at this location near the Red Chris mine. Obviously never used, and there's quite a few bridges along it, all of which would have to be replaced. But this is actually the cheapest route to get into Alaska. You could reactivate this, and then if you'd have to create you'd have to buy a new route through the Stikine Plateau.
Mm.
I can hear the environmentalists screaming at me just mentioning that, but it's the cheapest route. I get it. Like I'm just applying the geography.
Yeah.
But I know that this is where the woodland caribou live. This is remote region. Connect with the Alaska Highway and then follow the Alaska Highway route up to Alaska. That is your cheapest way, but not your shortest. And it might have some positive impact on all the major deposits in the Golden Triangle, but probably not, because the Golden Triangle needs better access down to Prince Rupert. The Golden Triangle is so named because there's everything in here. There's 50 odd mineable deposits in here of anything. Minerals that niobite or something like I've never even heard of before, up right down to normal, copper, zinc, gold, whatever. And there's other groups. There's groups looking at different portions of this map, different groups, and they become sort of I'm in communication with basically all the ones that I know about,
Hmm.
and the ones that I don't know about, I've done a really good job of hiding. So I've done my best at extracting information. Other remote resources that people should know about is, for example, Pine Point could be reactivated. There was a railway to Pine Point, south of Great Slave Lake at one point. This rocky thing means there's granite outcrops, usually related to Canadian Shield, which may or may not be useful as an aggregate source. Stony Rapids is a very large iron ore deposit in the middle of nowhere, at the northern tip of Saskatchewan. And we've got Ferguson Lake, which is another major heavy ore deposit in the middle of nowhere, Kivalliq. And then up in the Baffin region, we have at least two, up to probably three or four very big deposits. Mary River is, oh my gosh, it's several billion tons. It's a 50-year mine. It's
Hmm.
two 700-meter high mountains side by side that are grading 65% iron ore. That is
Wow.
Mary River. Okay.
Oh,
You have to, if you're in Vancouver, think of Grouse Grind. These two mountains are almost the size of Grouse Grind, and there's two of them side by side, and they're just iron ore. And
okay.
where you see here is the most northerly mining proposals in Canada. Baffinland, in my opinion, has done a really terrible job of planning how to get the iron ore out over the years. I've been involved with it directly or indirectly since 2003. They haven't listened. They haven't listened to me. They haven't listened to a whole bunch of other people. And their initial decision was to go down to a port here. And if you've lived up north and you know permafrost, you can look at the satellite and you go like you're basically crossing flat land, which is completely permafrost. You're basically building a railway on ice. Um, Permafrost comes in different
It
shades.
melts. It's impossible to, or it's not. It's very challenging to build
Yeah,
anything stable when every season you've got massive melt and the ground gets soaky. And what do you do?
exactly.
Yeah.
But the key thing from construction is what is your frost content?
Hmm.
Okay, if you're at 50% plus frost content, the ground looks one way. It gets very hummocky, there's ponds everywhere. And when you have less than 50% content or like 5% content, it looks much more like what you'd expect to see outside your backyard. Yeah, there might be permafrost there, but it has to do with the moisture content in the ground. So you tend to rockier will tend to have less. So when you're planning construction routes or infrastructure routes in the far north, you look for rocky ridges, things you normally avoid in the south, but you look for rocky ridges and go, can I build along this? Because then I've got my foundation built for me.
Right.
You understand? Okay.
Yeah.
So they chose this route. They decided it was too expensive to build. It was going to be something like $5 billion for 100 kilometers.
Hmm.
The gravel base was 9 meters high that they decided they would need so that these heavy haul trains could go across it without causing
Yeah. Collapsing.
deformation. And
Yeah.
the whole thing has to be underlaid by a meter of clay.
Right.
It's crazy. So they said, let's build up in Eclipse Sound. But Eclipse Sound is an ecological hotspot, and the ice conditions are crazy. There's a lot of currents. And so they tried that for 5 years and then they had to give up. But they did all the engineering work, so that's why it shows up on the map as green. So then they switched back to Stevensby Inlet. And I came back to them and said, guys, you do realize where more or less you see this yellow line is Rocky Ridges. Like it's twice as far, but you could get down. Probably cheaper, even though it's farther. And then me being
Wow.
me, I just put a bridge there. Why not? It's what a yellow line. It's a crayon on the map. And then there's another major deposit at Roche Bay near Sanirayak, which is Hall Beach. And then there's another one. There's a few others, but I'm not as certain on that, so I didn't put them on the map. The Grays Bay Port and Road proposal has been on a lot of people's minds. This is the proposal. This is the end of the existing ice road.
Hmm.
And there are a lot of deposits in this area, the most significant of which by far is Izok. But they're not focusing on Izok right now because they just basically want to get the basic infrastructure in place using smaller mines and then go for the big kahuna, which is Izok, which stands for something, which includes the Z is there for zinc or something. So when they talk about extending Grays Bay, connecting to the southern network, there's an ice road that goes along Contoida Lake all the way down to Yellowknife. And this is all rough tundra. And I'm going like, you really need a compelling reason to want to put your Canadian Arctic port there. It makes sense. Yeah, it's a mining extraction port, but I need a lot of convincing to believe that that is the best place to put the Canadian Arctic port. And then of course you've got Beaufort Sea, which is a natural gas.
Hmm.
Those are the big ones that a lot of people don't know about.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, no, that
resources. I can talk about ice. I can talk about the railroads. I can bore you to death as long as you want.
Oh man, no, I think Peter that this is exactly what needs to be because nobody talks like this anymore, you know? Like this used to
Mhm.
be a more common language to speak in terms of the physical reality of potential. When I read a lot of the manuals of Diefenbaker's cabinet and how they were thinking, how they were speaking to the population, and how the population was just deciding who they're going to vote for. Concepts like the Northern Vision that Diefenbaker was talking about to open up all of these different, advanced mining and science cities in the Arctic. That was normal conversation at taverns, in community like town halls all across Canada back in the 50s and 60s, and we've forgotten how to speak this language, and we can speculate on why that's happened, but point is I
Mhm.
think this is so important at this stage in our society to just recover this lost art of thinking about building a nation properly, and just this first degree thumbnail sketch that you just race through so quickly is really good as a starting point. And I would actually just like to sit down and listen to you just go off for 3 hours on a class. But that time doesn't allow for this particular session right now. But it's a good introduction. And I would ask you now, we got about 15 minutes left. Um, are you getting any receptivity amongst decision making, policy making circles that could make this happen either in Ottawa or in the provinces? What pros or cons are you facing there? And yeah, then I'll have a follow-up question depending on what you say.
That's a good question. I'm in active communication with one group which is focused on Alaska, another group which is focused on BC North Coast, and another group which is focused on Hudson Bay. Um, they are all they're all I'd say they're all frustrated with the pace of government responsiveness. For example, I showed this map to the former Deputy Minister of Transportation for Government of Alberta in January, and I basically, my associates and myself basically they took out a little trampoline, figuratively, and they picked up the rubber gloves and went boing. Go talk to the Infrastructure Bank of Canada. And it's like, do you know how hard it is to get 5 pennies out of the government of Canada if you aren't like, Trudeau's former babysitter? Like, are you serious? Um, and we weren't asking for a lot of money. We're just like, there's the key things that need to be done. We, the key thing is traffic projections. So you're looking at all these routes. If you build one and not another, how big is the pie? Or does the pie grow or shrink depending on your routes? Like the numbers that came out of the management firm were very, very promising. But then what happens if you reinforce the Port of Prince Rupert?
Hmm.
People don't know Port of Prince Rupert could handle 10 times its current traffic if they would connect Digby Island to Prince Rupert.
Hmm.
Digby Island is where the Prince Rupert Airport is. And then once you're at the airport island, Digby Island, you can go up to the Tsimshian Peninsula if the First Nations will allow it, of course, because that's mainly their property. But there's potentially 150 kilometers of usable port space there. It's almost the same size as Vancouver. Vancouver's at 150 million, but Vancouver could also handle a whole lot more if you go out along the north coast of
Yeah.
Burnaby. Anyway, um, so lost my chain of thought. Um,
In terms of the Canada Infrastructure Bank would never be able to would never want to bankroll something like this, and you were just going through the basics of what you would want to do, which would not cost very much money to just get a.
Oh, yeah, what we were asking money for. So basically, what are your traffic flows? So I went on a tangent with Prince Rupert. I'm sorry. So, okay, let's say the management consultant in 2021 is right and says if you build a connector from Anchorage to Chicago, you're going to have, let's say, 50 million tons a year. Okay. What happens if you then upgrade the port facilities at Prince Rupert, which is farther down the coast and closer to the lower 48? What happens? And then you get into a bunch of, you think they're quantitative questions. Okay, some folks would say, well, the pie is only so big, so the amount of traffic at Anchorage is going to go down, and then Prince Rupert is going to go up. Other models will say both will go up because now you have redundancy, so shippers will feel more secure. What is true? I'm not sure. Then you have other questions like, what about the politics of the railways? Because if you're going to access Prince Rupert more from the United States, you either are going up through Alberta or you're going up through BC. Either way, you're using CPKC. CPKC has a reputation. I'm going to say it's reputation because that's what I've heard, and they can't sue me for saying it. Of not being open to new haulages. So if CPKC is not interested in Prince Rupert because Prince Rupert is basically a CN line, that could affect things as well. So that's not, it's not just a mathematical question when you think it, and you have to do this modeling with all the different ports and all the different routes,
Mm,
and also get a feel for the capacity of the railways.
mm.
I've got some sense of that, and you'd be surprised. I've been very, very surprised. For example, do you know there's two tracks just north of downtown Edmonton? One stick of dynamite, you'd shut down the entire CN system
They're very
because
fragile.
everything funnels into these two side-by-side tracks at CN Rail just north of downtown Edmonton, and everything funnels out of these two side-by-side tracks that go over, I don't know, 30th Avenue or something. It's 66, I don't know, anyway, 66 anyway. It's just two tracks side by side, the entire CN system. There's no other bypass route around these two tracks. It's crazy. Um, so you have to think about these kinds of pinch points.
Mm.
Um, Another sidetrack is like the Baikal-Amur Railway in Siberia, which was meant to be a northern assistant to the Trans-Siberian Railway, generally failed because they built the railway, but they didn't think about each end. The connector point where it meets the Trans-Siberian near Lake the Baikal region doesn't have enough capacity, so the trains can't get onto the railway. And then at the port side, Pitramiorsk or something like that, which is north of Vladivostok, they didn't build enough ports facility so that they can put big trains on it, but the big trains can't offload or unload or get onto the track. So it was never used. So you have to look at these pinch points as well because they play very having adequate transfer capacity is a big side of that.
Mm.
Okay, so there's the physical side of it. Then there's the First Nations. There's been a lot of runarounds with First Nations. They have all been screwed over very, very badly over the years. They are the logical choice for being part of what we're calling an Indigenous-owned corridor management consortium. Basically, get the network of corridors out on the land, get it on the map, get it under a consortium. It's separated from First Nation politics under a government charter, and this type of investment ready. So if one private group wants to build a pipeline over here, they want to go to from point A to point B, they're covered. If they want to build a railway over here, that's fine. The private sector can duke it out over raising the funds. So it's creating an investment-ready vehicle that takes away the uncertainty of, the Impact Assessment Act or the 20-year regulatory hurdles or just what goes on in the resource investment world is beyond imagination. So it's creating that consortium, getting the First Nations involved, creating a governance structure, doing the preliminary analysis, checking on the engineering. I mean, I've put down the data as it exists right now, but there, that you can build there doesn't necessarily mean you should build there. For example, everyone says, "Oh, let's extend the railway through Fort Nelson and get it up to Watson Lake, so we can access the mines up there." Well, when you have a close look at this region, which I did a few months ago, you can't get through it by rail except you build a 20-kilometer tunnel, or you do like switchbacks that are like out of some kind of Minecraft thing. Like the costs are beyond belief.
Yeah.
You really need to get up north
Mm.
through Fort Yard, where the line is wiggly. It's wiggly for good reason, but you don't need 20-kilometer tunnels.
Mm.
Those kinds of pinch points. So it's like basically a few $1 million per each of these three corridors. One to Arctic Alaska, which are kind of the same thing. One to Pacific Coast. One to Hudson Bay. And you have to people get very, and I think it should be done coordinated. People get very stuck on a certain particular project. And I don't want to pick on any particular project too much, but for example, I'm looking at Hudson Bay, and there's some people are all Churchill, some people are all for Port Nelson, and there's an argument. Well, we're going to Churchill against Port Nelson, right? But you go over to Chesterfield Inlet, the ice conditions are actually much better up here because the wind blows from the north. So as ice breaks up, it tends to keep this area clear. Plus, which Chesterfield Inlet is 100 feet deep, 200 kilometers inland. right up to this point. You can get an ocean freighter right up to here, no
Hmm.
problem. If you ice break and then it's sheltered. But then, then you can also access Ferguson Point. So there's these trade-offs, and you can see Kaminari calving area. Kaminari is one of the largest caribou herds. I'm just trying to highlight that. That's another thing I have to work around is when I worked for the Nunavut Planning Commission, the biologist would come to me and say, you can't do anything in a caribou calving ground. Never, never touch it. Never touch it. You'll extirpate the herd. Okay, so that's what we do. We mark it as, thou shalt not build anything there. And then you look for 10 years later, which I'm looking at the map, what I just had on the map, and the Kaminari calving herd has moved.
Yeah.
And they've moved right up close to the town, and they've gone to the AER mines and past the AER mines. So the
Yeah.
caribou are now calving next to a mine.
Yeah. The playing field keeps changing. If you,
The playing field keeps changing. So
yeah.
when biologists are saying you do this, you're going to destroy an entire species. Now you have to go like, is this true? Give you a great
Yeah.
example. Tuktut National Park. Have you ever heard of it? No.
No.
But it's right on the border between Nunavut and Northwest Territories. It is there. Tuktut means young caribou. It was established to protect the most important caribou herd calving ground in the Western Arctic.
Mhm.
You don't have the national park here, this entire herd will go extinct, or the blue nose herd will go extinct. Since they've established it 25 years ago, there's never been a single caribou born there because when they established it, all the caribou moved to the next location over.
Well,
So
I
they
guess
have a
that's
national
part of
park on
the
basically a flat piece of Arctic tundra.
yeah, right. I guess part of what you're alluding to here on a number of levels is that the problem is really in the way we have allowed ourselves to normalize our thinking about managing our resources, managing our society, which is incompetent. On the one hand, you have people who focus on particulars and they lose the contextual chemistry in which that particular project is operating
Yeah.
within, which is very dynamic. It's not you can't calculate like the nature of the particular project is entirely shaped by its environment, by a lot of other variables that compartmentalized thinking doesn't allow us to appreciate, but it is true still. And then the other thing is on the opposite extreme. There's this tendency to for those who do think holistically, who think about a whole system, they think about it from the standpoint of these I guess these ecological photo takers where it's whatever exists at a given moment that you're looking at the thing is what they just crystallize and they think that you can begin to manage rules about what you're allowed to do or not allowed to do, mostly not allowed to do based upon like some current configuration of what the environment is at this moment without thinking about the environment as a process of change, which it absolutely is, as you pointed out
Mhm.
wonderfully. No caribou has been born in this caribou protection zone, as
Yeah.
the nature of the caribou is to move. It's what they do. So how do you
Yes.
work with that logic? It's,
So I guess summarize the question, I feel
yeah.
the government of Alberta, most elements of the government of Alberta are definitely in favor. The premier is 100% in favor of looking at corridors to the northwest and east
Mhm.
out of Alberta. She wants more corridors. I sometimes have my doubts about whether the bureaucracy is up to that task. They're very focused on maintaining the highways. It's kind of a new realm for them. On the other hand, there's people that get it, and I'm not knocking people that highway people that aren't suddenly asked to do a look at Arctic Railway, but um, uh, you tend to deal with a lot of stodginess at the government of Northwest Territories. Government Yukon, I haven't had a lot of experience with myself. Government of BC seems to be pro-development, not one day and anti-development the next. But
What about the
it's
natives? Like a lot of people think that the natives don't want this sort of thing. At least that's the image conveyed to a lot of people living in urban areas that, the First Nations people are anti-development because whatever, I don't know the logic, but is that true in your experience or is there
no.
more openness to have these types of conversations and to go in this direction?
I'm glad you asked that because I missed a major point in my earlier discussion. In 2023, when I restarted this work, I called 25, 30 odd First Nations and I said, I worked with A2A Rail. Do you want me to keep pushing this? See what I can get to. And the answer for all of them except one, and this is now covering most of northern Alberta and a good and corner of BC's and Northwest Territories, was we want to be part of it, but from before it starts. We want it to be done right. And we want to be part owners. We don't want to be excluded again, like the the Canadian Pacific Railway, kicked us out and put us on reserves. We want to be part. We wrote the treaties. We signed the treaties under an understanding that we were going to be sharing the wealth of the land and our wisdom of the land would be shared. And that was completely violated. We don't want that to happen again. So I said, great. So I continued on that, and I built some good relationships with First Nations along the corridor. A lot of other people are working with First Nations. I'm trying not to step on their toes as well. But I see them as the corridor owners and managers, and eventually owners a lot of the infrastructure. And as wealth accrues, you build industrial zones along these new railways. I see this as the the solution to economic reconciliation is even if the nations aren't on the corridor, they can be investors therein. And I think that's a central component. And they tend to have a better sense of what ecological risks are. When I worked in Nunavut, the folks telling me the caribou calve there, they always calve there, they will always calve there, do not build anything there, we're always white. The Inuit would say, the caribou are there this generation, but next generation they're going to be over here. Okay, but when they say generation, they don't mean caribou generation, they mean people generation. So my grandson will be hunting caribou over here. I'm hunting caribou over here today because the caribou have a system that they've figured out over several hundred years. We need that information to do these things right. Are there solutions? Yes. Wildlife overpasses, scheduling, comprehensive scheduling, familiarization. There's tricks on how to do these things, and you have to do it right from day one. And that's what I believe we are doing. And by the way, the one nation that said no it said A2A Rail said we're going to build a railway. It got screwed up. It's just another hoax. But other than that, I like the idea.
Yeah, so it seems like they would be pretty easy to persuade if we could actually get some momentum going. They would probably, if they could believe that it could happen, would change their tune pretty quickly. That's very interesting.
The leaders I'm talking to, they're talking about being in the driver's seat,
Great.
not actually, not just being passive, but actually being the business people building these things and running
That's
them.
great. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a really important lesson. Because I think you have so many dishonest agencies that have been trying to speak for the First Nations people, but with the idea of using them manipulatively in order to convey this false notion that the First Nations are intrinsically anti-tech, anti-development, that they just want to, you know, I don't know, just be left alone in their reservations and that's it. And
Yeah.
it's like, that's if you actually speak to the people living there, they don't want that at all. They want
No.
progress. They want to
Yeah.
have but they just don't want to be screwed over again. That's the only
Yeah.
primary issue, it
Exactly. And they
seems.
want it to be done right.
Yeah. And
Build it
I
right.
like this what you made the point that if you're going to do something like this, you need to have an understanding of the laws of nature instead of just sort of skipping steps. If you truly understand the the climatological, the biomechanisms that are built into the ecosystems, if you truly understand it, then you can work with nature naturally in a way that is not destructive. If I think there's too many cases in at least the recent 60, 70 years, maybe longer, where human beings have often tried to skip steps, just turn a resource into money as quickly as possible.
Mhm.
And then, surprise, surprise, you do a lot of damage and give development itself a bad name along the way. But if you actually do it the way you're talking about, by learning from the long observed wisdom of the First Nations who have been living with nature, they've been observing the caribou, and then you incorporate that into your own systems planning, you get a very different effect. You don't have to destroy nature all of a sudden. You can have both nature and progress coexisting at the same time, and they're all of a sudden not two different opposing worlds. They can be part of the same universe, which is, I think, a very inspiring idea. Yeah.
What I've said before, this might be, I know where time is up, but
Yep.
I mean, very often with Indigenous persons, when I'm talking to them, the way they say is the impression, the understanding I get from most of them is, look, the creator came along, he made the world, and he made a whole bunch of different types of people, and he put different people in different spots on the world to be the stewards of those parts of the world. And he says it's not that it's development versus conservation, it's that the the natural systems are set up to be stewarded by those people.
Mhm.
And so they actually run better when people are involved appropriately and giving their advice. So I try to internalize that in my perspective is like, I'm just looking at topography when I put these lines on the map, but how the details of the construction and where they go and whether you choose this route or that route, um, or you move things over by 10 miles, that is really where the Indigenous persons, the elders go, this is what you need to do, and this is how it'll work over the next 7 or 10 or 15 generations.
Yeah.
Because guess what? My family was kicked out of Russia in 1900s because by crazy people with pitchforks. They've been here for 120 years, right? These guys, these other folks that I talk to, they go like, to back 10,000 years. They get it.
Peter, this is cool, man. I really appreciated this so
Oh, my
much.
pleasure.
And yeah, I'm looking forward to future conversations. And yeah, I'm gonna make sure that anybody who wants to have a look and examine your map can go to the description box under this video, check it out. Any other links that you'd like me to share with people, just send it my way. And thank you so much. Thank you everybody for listening to this Canadian Patriot podcast. And we'll speak to you shortly for another one in the next 2 days. Take care.
Okay, thank you.